something a little different today. They want to do a panel. A lot of people have asked for panels. We've done them in the past. They're pretty successful. One of the panels that have come up is fishing Green Bay. It turned out better than I could have ever imagined. I mean, some of the fish they're catching out there, I mean, these guys will talk about that a little bit, but these guys right here, one of the things I mentioned before is we want guys that are out there doing this all the time. You've got Phil Stodola, you got Zach Stadler, and you got Joel McClung. Come on, there we go, we got it. That's what I wanted to see. Woo-hoo. There we go, we got it. But these guys, how many of you fish Green Bay? A few. How successful are you at fishing Green Bay? Be honest, come on. Yeah, see, look at Phil's being like, I'm not saying much, but yeah, I do all right, you know. Here's the thing. These guys, if you're not, and you need some help, these are the guys that are gonna help you do better. So I'm gonna give the floor to them, and what I'm gonna do is, I'm just telling you, I'm impressed what happened with Green Bay. I hope it continues. We're going to go ahead and we're gonna, basically have them introduce themselves, and then maybe a little bit of history, what you know about Green Bay, and then also I think we're gonna start, kind of pinpointing how to go about fishing that water. What do you think? Because no matter what, there's a lot of people that fear Green Bay, but I'm gonna tell you what, it's just a lake. It's just a different size. People look at a body of water like Green Bay and they go, it used to be people would look at the Chippewa Fjord and go, oh my God. Now they got 250, horses on the back of their hydro blaster, and they run around and hit spots within 15 minutes on the other side, back and forth. You gotta fish it within sections. Wouldn't you agree with that? You gotta take it, not as a body of water, as a whole. And this is, I came to understand this because I've spent a lot of time down in Florida. And when you look at the ocean, well, that's water. But you know what? It's just like a lake. It breaks down just like a lake. It's just a bigger body of water. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let you guys introduce yourself, tell them what you do on Green Bay, and then we're just gonna let this go where it goes, and hopefully you can give enough information to these people, that they can have more success in Green Bay, okay? Phil?
My name is Phil Stodola. I guide on Green Bay, obviously. I've been a guide since 2018. I'm also a full-time fireman for the city of Manitowoc, but I get enough time off. I get to do a lot of guiding out there, so I'm out there as much as I can be.
Hi, my name is Joel McClung. I'm also a part-time guide on Green Bay. Full-time teacher at NWTC in Green Bay. I teach auto collision repair. Been fishing it for about 15 years, primarily for muskie, and guiding this is my 5th year.
My name is Zach Stadler. I've been a full-time guide for 7 years, started in 2016. I guide for walleyes, smallmouth, and muskie, also duck hunts in the fall. So I spend most of my time from late July, early August, all the way till October guiding muskies.
So, one of the biggest things I just mentioned, it's a big body of water, tremendous amount of acreage. And I think that's probably the biggest fear, that people have, to approach Green Bay. So how would you, for these people, how would you go about approaching Green Bay? The full-time guy.
So when I'm looking at new areas, one of my biggest things I look for is the contour. I get up on a map and I look at contour lines. I want to find a nice finger or something like that has deep water, is adjacent to deep water, so a shallow water finger adjacent to deep water, and then I will go there in the boat, won't even bring a rod the first time. I'll just go there with my sonar and I'll graph it out, looking for weeds and bait. So muskies out of Green Bay are like a pack of wolves. They follow the shad around like crazy. So if you find the shad, you're gonna find the muskies.
So basically what you just mentioned, you said, you try to find shallow fingers. So it goes back to what I said before. You're trying to find the lake, the structure within the lake. You're not just, people go on a lake and they look at a fishing hotspot map, they say, oh wow, they mark the spots, but that's not the case here. You gotta treat it just like a lake. You're finding the fingers. Are there flats? I don't know. Phil's gonna take me out there this year, and he's gonna show me. But do you have flats out there?
Yeah. So piggybacking on Zach's point, I think the biggest thing to think about too is seasonally what those fish are doing. Like earlier in the season, those fish are going to be really shallow bays, tributaries. Like the community spot that kind of everybody gets run over is the Fox River. So like things like that. So if you think about in the spring, those fish are tight to shore. They're right in the shallows, and like I said, shallow slack water stuff. Or you go to smaller sections that might be a smaller bay that almost fishes like an inland lake. But you have to think about seasonally too. Like the first 2 or 3 weeks of season, that's the ticket. But if you're fishing in August and you go cast right on shore in the Fox River, the chances are you're not going to be where you want to be. So kind of seasonally too, you have to kind of think about where those fish are at, and mainly that there's no natural reproduction on Green Bay. Those fish are all from stocked fish, but those fish do go through the motions in the spring before season. So as they get up there, they're in the kind of spawning spots, and the first chance that we get at them is when they're right post spawn, and so they're going to be, like I said, shallow bays and tributary. And then summer, we're looking at more like open weed flats out on the bay. And like Zach said, if you're looking for a spot, a newer spot, not a community spot, you can kind of look and find those community spots and think about what that's offering to those fish, and then just try and find that in other areas is what I try to do when I'm looking for new spots.
Joe, you want to put 2 cents here?
I remember the first time I went out on the bay to cast, and I went out from the boat launch. I was just like, what the hell am I doing out here? I didn't even know where to start. So to their point, electronics is huge, using your mapping, and then going there and just, before you even take a cast, drive around, map it out, see what's there. You have to put in the time to find the spot before you start to actually fish the spot.
I agree with that. I think a lot of people hit Green Bay, they look at it, they do, like I mentioned, a map, and then they look at it, and I think some people, I'm not saying that everybody does this, but I see this with people. They'll buy a fishing hotspots map, which is, it's not a bad map, it's just, in some cases, it isn't always, how do I want to put this? I don't think it's correct in a lot of cases. It can give you some ideas to start, but you need to spend the time looking and finding the spots within the spots. So I think that's, one of the key things is, is when you're dealing with this, is that you're going to have to spend the time to break it down. And I think people are always in a hurry. All 3 of these guys belong to Titletown chapter of Muskies Inc. And I don't know how many of you belong to the Titletown chapter of Muskies Inc., but it's an excellent, excellent club. These guys have done a tremendous amount of work helping the stocking of these fish, raising money for the forage, for these fingerlings and stuff. If you don't belong to, how many of you belong to a muskie club here in Wisconsin? For those of you, that's awesome. And for those of you who don't, please consider that. You don't realize how much work that these clubs put in to make fishing better for you. Yes?
How come the muskies don't spawn?
Why they don't spawn?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So
Huh?
We've seen the eggs.
right. So they do produce the eggs, and they think that it's a habitat issue is the short answer.
That's right.
UW Stevens Point did a big telemetry study. I believe it was 2017 to 21, and I was just starting to guide them, but like Zach helped out, and Chris Barch and a lot of the other guys that are out there. Basically, they planted radio transmitters into a lot of these fish that were caught, and basically they, almost like they do with the wolves, where they have a tracker and they can see where those fish go, and they had basically beacons at the mouth of every tributary, and basically going out to Death's Door and everywhere that they could go to get out of the bay. And basically they tracked those fish all over for a whole year. And another thing that they did, those biologists from UW Stevens Point came in and talked at our club, and they said, in the spring, if you see a spawning pair, let us know where those fish are. and basically like if you saw one, you know, in a river or in wherever, they would go out and they would collect soil samples from underneath them. They would analyze it, and they found that there was less than 1% of actually fertilized eggs. Like out of millions of eggs, there was hardly any that were actually fertilized. So they think that whether it be not good, you know, and I'm not a biologist, so this is all just what I remember from what they told me, but they're not the right soil or not the right shoreline, vegetation, stuff like that, but basically it's a habitat issue is what they think. They're hoping if they can find something where fish are successfully spawning, where they can recreate that habitat. And then,
Yeah, close.
And then hopefully get some naturally reproducing fish out there. That'd be ultimately what we'd love to see. So.
You know, fish can go through the motions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that habitat is ideal in order for them to incubate and hatch. So they have to continue the stocking. I mean, there was nothing, and I think today, you guys don't even blink an eye at a 4-foot fish, do you?
Oh yeah, we blink an eye. I get to 37, I'm doing a happy dance in the back of the boat still. I mean, a muskie's a muskie at the end of the day, but another thing to go off of the spawning with muskies, what a lot of people don't realize, even up north inland lakes, is a lot of the fish that are in a lot of lakes up there aren't naturally producing fish, they're stocked fish. So we're not a whole big difference. There is very, like Phil said, very, very, very slim chance of catching a naturally production fish. I've been guiding for 7 years, and I've actually caught one that I'm 90% sure it was a natural fish because it had both fins, but the fins do grow back if they're not clipped correctly, but the fins did have no distinctive mark off them. But 7 years, I put countless muskies in the boat, and to have one fish that I think could possibly be natural reproduction shows that there is none. The soil, from going off Phil too with the Stevens Point guys, because I talked to them, I had them in my boat when handing over muskies to put the transmitters in. And one of the big things they said with the eggs is actually the sediment from the Fox River will get on the eggs, and that's what will cause them not to get fertilized.
Well, that's why when they're hatching when they take eggs and they put them in a hatchery, that's why they got them moving. The water's flowing, and they keep the eggs moving so that sediment does not build up on them, and that's how they hatch them. It's kind of interesting. So, and you made a comment before, Zach. That is the case here in Wisconsin in most of our waters. If it isn't for stocking right now, you are not going to have a population of fish.
I would agree. It needs to continue to be stocked. We're seeing the result of them not stocking for a few years. There's a gap between the really big fish. We're seeing the 55s and 56s showing up, and then you got the 50s. And now, how many 42s and 43s are you catching now? So,
either giant or sorry. Yeah, I agree. They had the VHS here on Lake St. Clair, and then normally the DNR from Wisconsin trades eggs and milt from those fish with St. Clair and with the Green Bay fish. And so when they did that, they didn't stock any fish because they were worried about the milt and the eggs from St. Clair bringing VHS to Green Bay. So we see that window, like when we were catching fish 2 or 3 years ago, it was either going to be a big giant fish, like 50 plus, or it was going to be, would you say high 30s, like low to mid 30s. There were hard, like when I first started fishing out there, it was like you'd usually go out, and if you caught, like an average fish would be like mid 40s. And then a few years after that, just, you know, like a few years ago, you wouldn't see any of those mid 40s fish. It was like a clear window where it was like they were low to mid 30s, and then they would jump and be like 4 foot or even 50-inch plus. It was just a crazy, you could just see right where that gap in the stocking was, and you wouldn't have any of those. And now they're starting to get bigger, where you're seeing a lot of high 40s fish, and it's nice to see that, obviously.
And like Phil says, right now we're in a time where you're not, you know, it used to be you go out, you know, like you said 2 years ago, and you have a great chance. I mean, you're putting in low to mid 50s, 1 or 2 a week. Now we're getting to the point where it's a little bit harder to catch those because we're in that gap right now. Those big fish they got old, they died. I mean, it's just nature runs its course, but they're starting to come back. We're starting to see them now. You know, like last year was, I'm guessing last year was going to be probably this year and last year were going to be the harder the years for the big giant fish, they're still going to be out there because it's Green Bay, and some just mature faster. But it's definitely down, the big fish number. But I'm thinking the number of 50s out there this year is going to be ridiculous, and I mean, everyone wants to catch their 50s muskie.
And I agree with what you're saying. I think you're going to have a tremendous amount of 50s this year, and hopefully you guys are going to be real busy, you know, to provide us a lot of smiles on a lot of people's face and the magic mark of 50 inches.
You want to go ahead? Yeah.
Can you address warm water, warm air, like dangerous temperatures, and when do you fish, when don't you fish?
For with us guiding, I won't go over 77. If I have a client, I'll offer a walleye or a bass trip for them. Kind of say, hey, you know, we can't really musky fish today. Or what we'll do is we'll have the musky gear, and we'll go out for the first hour and a half in the morning musky fish before the water warms up. And then once that water warms up, usually there's a walleye bite going on pretty close. We'll go and fish walleyes. And if it's like a full day trip, once it gets in the afternoon, or a dark to dark trip, then once it gets in the afternoon, that water temperature starts to come back down again. Then we can switch gears and go back to musky fishing again. But we watch that water temperature.
These guys here, I commend them. They really put a lot of emphasis, you know, on catch and release. They do have a booth here, and if anybody has questions about catch and release, they're there to help. And that's why we have that booth there, is to hopefully help people become better at releasing some of these fish, you know. So if you get a chance, you definitely want to stop by their booth. So how do you go about fishing it, you know, go out and fishing it efficiently? What baits do you use, or that you've had your best success on? I mean, are you throwing bucktails like they are on the inland water lakes? Are you using crankbaits more?
So first thing, like when I'm gonna go fishing with folks, is look at the weather. That's the number one concern. What direction is the wind coming from? How big is the wind blowing? You know, if it's gonna be 15 plus, we're probably talking about not going fishing that day. 3 to 4 footers is not a lot of fun to be standing up and casting. So we just figure the way the wind's gonna go, that's gonna dictate where I'm gonna go fish. And then I'll talk about bucktails first. That seems to be king on the bay. They love bucktails in the summertime. Find a flat where the wind's blowing up into those weeds, and number 8s, 9s, 10s. I like the big willows. They all work colors, changes by the year.
When you say willows, you're talking about those rages?
I like the Rocky Point bucktails.
Yeah, those things are dynamite, aren't they?
Yeah, they work very well for me. But color, it just seems like every year there seems to be one hot color that works, and it just takes a while to figure it out. And because the fish, they are finicky. They'll get dialed into something, a certain color, a certain vibration, and that's what they want. And if you can figure that out, multiple fish days is a real possibility out there.
Yeah, it seems like definitely year to year there's definitely like a big change as far as like in talking to other guides and stuff. It seems like in the first couple of days of the season, like I remember like 3-4 years ago, we were catching almost everything it felt like on rubber. Like it was like medusas or swim baits or whatever, and it was like 2018, 2019, and the next year I remember coming back and I think I saw Zach in the river and I'm like, oh, you can't see a chiropractor appointments, they're eating bucktails again. Like hallelujah, like they're back on the blade bites, it's great. But like it seems like it's definitely, you can find those patterns. Like 2019, I remember specifically we were throwing the swimming dogs and we had blades in front of them and we were just hammering fish almost every day in the early season. As far as bucktails go, I definitely, if I have 2 clients casting, I try and have the person in the front throwing a bucktail, kind of on that Josh Borowski theory that if a fish is positive and it wants to eat, that's the highest percentage hookup bait, and it's an easy target for them. It's moving straight, it's moving quickly, and they can just come up and grab it. If I'm going to have somebody throwing rubber, you know, I have all sorts of different experience levels in my boat, and if I have guys that don't necessarily have a lot of experience, I'll probably have them throw either 2 bucktails or a bucktail and a topwater, just because those are easier baits to work. Types of bucktails, I always say, I've tried 100 different bucktails. For me, in my boat, it seems like Green Bay muskies just love eating spankies. You can troll them, you can cast them, you can do whatever you want with them, but if I had one lure that I had to fish from start to end of season, it would be a black and green spanky with a black and antifreeze type blade or whatever. And I mean, especially this last year, we trolled bucktails a lot later in the season than I normally would. It was like normally like we get off that summer bite, which is kind of the casting bite, and we start trolling. In the first week or so of September, I'll be running bucktails trolling. Mike was with us in October. We ended up catching a nice, mid-40s fish on a bucktail. We put more bucktails down and actually got more bites that day. The 7.9 trigger from Musky Mayhem just has a little bit different sound to it too. We trolled and casted those as well in the last couple years. Those were good for us. But I like weather-wise. I think if it's bright and sunny out, I like to throw a lot of gold and copper. And if it's darker out or the water's darker, I like to throw like possibly like a shiny black blade and then a painted bright color blade, whether it be chartreuse or orange or whatever. I think mixing that up seems to give them a pretty good target, and it seems to help in my mind at least.
So I'm gonna let a little cat out of the bag too for Green Bay. Sorry guys. If you come to Green Bay and it starts getting cold out, you're in a cold front, I'll tell you right now, pick up your Medusas, your Bulldogs. Cold fronts, those fish love rubber. So I don't like to have guys throwing a rubber all summer long. Rubber is, I catch them opening day of muskie season on rubber, and I'll catch them the last day of muskie season on rubber. They'll eat rubber all year long. Bucktails, I look at water temp is a big thing for me with bucktails. There it gets down to a certain point, and that's when I switch and just run straight. Like if I'm trolling, I run straight crankbaits once it gets down to a certain water temperature. It seems like they just key in on those crankbaits a little bit more. And going back on the experience level too, with having guys always picking a bucktail for a guy without much experience level. I had one client of mine one year, hopped in the boat, no experience whatsoever. I had to actually teach him how to cast the muskie rod. He just wanted to catch a big fish. That's what he wanted. So we went out, we were set up on a spot, and I was like, okay, just start casting. For a half hour he casted. Finally he got where he could cast about 30 yards. And I said, okay, we're gonna go fish. And he went back-to-back casts with a 53 and a 51.5. So experience level isn't always actually a lot of times I like people that don't have as much experience, because you tell them something and they do it. Yep, you get someone, Phil tells me to do something, it's like, I'm not gonna do that, I'm gonna keep fishing how I do it.
Well, here's what I'm gathering. I've never fished Green Bay. I'm basically an inland water fisherman. I've guided for 17 years. The reality is a fish over 44 inches is a big fish. I don't care what anybody says. I was very fortunate. I worked under Tony Rizzo. I've seen the big fish that man puts in the boat. Those big fish are not as prevalent as they used to be. That's a fact. But then what you're telling me about Green Bay is, I've heard all these stories about 60 inchers. So you're telling me that, which I appreciate, I hear this stuff, but you're saying, here's the reality. A big fish is peaking out at 55. That's still a tremendous fish. I don't care where you go in North America, and I think it's the top of the line, as far as a fish of that size. But yet you got 50s and 51s and 52s, so people have a chance to hit that magic mark, because it's not a common mark to hit all the time. I've heard about crankbaits, that's all I hear. So the crankbait thing is more for trolling then.
Yeah.
It's really what you're doing. You're not casting crankbaits.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, in the spring, we cast crankbaits a little bit. We find some rockier spots. Personally, I like to find a little bit rockier spots, and that's when I'll throw a crankbait. In the spring, when I say spring too, I mean opener tide. But yeah, I like to bang some crankbaits, cast crankbaits out and bang them off rocks. But otherwise, like midsummer, I will hardly ever throw a crankbait.
Yeah, Yes.
You know, like everyone fishes in the tributaries and the Fox in the spring and some of the shallower water, and it seems like everyone disappears for like a couple weeks in June and then finally it's in July. Can you talk about a little bit where you're fishing then and why and where you are at what time of the year?
That's a good question.
So yeah, that first week or two of the season, the fish are all in the rivers, hopefully. We don't have a quick warm up. After that, it seems like those fish slide out into the bay and they're recuperating. And I know a lot of the full-time guides don't musky fish at that time, just because the fish are scattered, they're out suspended, they're following schools of walleyes, perch around, just recuperating. So I know a lot of full-time guides, they go back to walleye fishing trips, perch fishing, things like that. People do want to chase muskies in that kind of mid to later June, early July time frame. I've been going up to Door County a little bit more, Sturgeon Bay, and the water stays a little cooler. I think the fish stay a little more localized, they don't roam as much. So does that answer?
Yeah. You know, like so like July starts, are you fishing like 6 feet flats, whatever, and then move out deeper? Do you ever fish like the 20-foot basin?
I don't fish that deep. I usually start looking on those flats, you know, that top out at 4 or 5 feet. Again, we're looking for where that new weed growth is starting to develop. And then it's just, you know, try it up shallow, try it off the break a little bit farther, just try to, and again, the use of the new electronics, it breaks that learning curve so much faster now. You can actually find where the fish are hanging or find where more bait is hanging too, so.
Yeah, I would say generally in the summertime, like the spring, it's super shallow. Like I tell my clients in the spring that if they're casting the shore and if they're not snagging sticks and trees and stuff that's by the shore, like once an hour, they're not casting close enough to shore. And then as it gets out, like Joel was saying, like most of the guides on Green Bay, there's only a couple of guys that'll actually take musky guide trips basically from maybe the second week in June up until basically the end of July, and that's when they start sliding. Like those fish go out. I think they chase a lot of bait. They're basically out roaming around. Kind of, it's hard to pinpoint them at that point, and there's not a lot of guys that are catching those fish. And then it's hard to book a trip unless somebody knows. It's that time of year. It's so inconsistent. They could be in one spot, and you have a heavy wind, and all of a sudden that bait moves, and those fish are gone. So I mean, I personally, if I haven't fished with somebody before, if they want to know when they should come and fish, I either book them the first 3 weeks of the season, or I wait until end of July, August, and those are pretty much the times that I do casting trips. And then once we get into September, depending on the weather, I usually start running trolling trips starting in September then. So basically, to your question about the depth, a lot of those spots that are weed spots, there's like 5 or 6 feet of water with the weeds coming up. This year I did mark a lot of fish for, like, I would run a trolling trip and troll kind of on weed edges and fish off the edges a little bit. And I actually ended up marking a lot of fish further out on my side scan, so we ended up catching more fish this year. I think up until this year, the deepest I'd ever caught a muskie was probably 15 or 16 feet, and that was trolling on Green Bay, and we ended up fishing off weed flats and fishing more in like 20 feet some of the time, and in the summer yet. And we were catching fish. And we did catch some fish in that 20 to 21 foot range, which for me was the deepest I've caught fish on Green Bay. I grew up closer to Milwaukee. We fished Oconomowoc, Okachi, so I was used to fishing that deep water all the time. So for me, coming to Green Bay and learning the system and having to fish in 5 feet of water, like I was twitchy, I didn't like it. I was like, not my thing, but I obviously had to learn. I knew that there's a lot of big fish there, and it was worth figuring that all out. Tony?
When you control with your mouth on the water, you feel that gives you an advantage. And then second, when you're trolling with your gas motor, are you catching prop wash fish?
Yeah, so I mean, if I'm running a trolling trip, I'm going to be running my kicker no matter what. I usually do try and steer with the trolling motor. I use the heading lock and stuff like that. This year, I caught more fish on a down rod and prop rods and prop wash type stuff than I've caught probably in the other 4 or 5 years I've had guiding combined. It seemed like the one that Mike caught that I mentioned earlier, that was a later in the season fish on a bucktail, that was a down rod fish, and it was for whatever reason this year we were just catching a lot more on the down rods. But that definitely is a factor. I think that having that bucktail or whatever you want to run in your prop wash. Later in the season I'll run a bigger bucktail or a bigger crankbait, but I think the prop wash fish is definitely a thing that happens often enough.
And I am one of those guys that never runs a down rod. I know they work. It's just more of the fact of I like to have the planer boards. I like to have my spacing out from my boat. I don't want to have to crank in a rod when I hook. Like when I'm trolling too, like you were saying with your motor, my trolling motor is in every trolling trip. It doesn't matter if there's 5 footers, if it's flat calm. My trolling motor's in because as soon as we hook up, I kill my kicker motor, but I keep pulling forward very slowly with my trolling motor. That way it keeps my boards out, it keeps them going, so that fish can come straight in the back of the boat and I don't have to pull in. If some days I'm running 15 rods. I don't have to pull all 15 rods in with hooking one fish. This way I only have to just fight the fish, and then once you get the fish in the net, release it, and that, you start going again. I just have to set one rod.
One thing that I just got out of what you told me, when I look at, Green Bay, to me it looks like the abyss, and like you had said, how are you going to approach this? You just got rid of, 60% of the water. Is there anybody else that has any questions at all? Yes.
Do you focus at all on the shipping lanes?
In the late fall, we will follow the shipping channel, a couple of the shipping channels in the lower bay. It seems like, for me personally, I notice that a lot of bait fish stacks up in there. I don't notice any correlation with the ships coming through and the fish being there. I just see that the bait kind of stacks up in the shipping channels, and they probably follow the shipping channel just as a navigation route because it's going straight to where they want to go. But I will run edge of channels because I've noticed that fish will stack up on them in the late fall, following the shad in.
It sounds to me like these fish are probably more prevalent in finding or following the forage. So if you find forage, you're going to find muskies, which, yeah. So we got time for one more question. These guys told me this, for everybody that was here, they're in the Titletown booth, and that they're going to mark your maps. If you've got any maps of Green Bay, I'd be more than happy to show you those
Show you where all the
spots.
boat launches are.
Yeah, show you where the boat launches are. What's that? Sure, sir.
Live bait musky fishing on the bay, does anybody do that?
Yeah, it's been starting to get more popular in the fall. I've been seeing it in the river.
Okay.
So,
I think it's tough just because until those fish push back into the river in the very late fall, I've had guys ask that, well, why don't we just, because basically once you get into September and October, you're trolling these huge flats that go for miles, and you're just trying to mark bait, and obviously then mark fish on your side scan. So we're literally fishing, sand, and there's a couple big shoals that, run across the bay, whatever, but you're basically fishing these big giant flats, and you're looking for shad. And, if you're going to try and, we're running around for 8 hours or 10 hours or whatever, and we're going, 3.5 miles an hour or whatever around that. So you're putting on all those miles to try and find these fish because they're spread out. It's not like you're going to sit, and sit in one spot in the fall out on the bay and try and cast. I know I don't try to do that. It's basically the trolling aspect of it is just to cover so much water, hoping that you're going to not only find the fish, but then find an active fish. So the idea of hanging a sucker and going that slowly, in the river it'd be a possibility, but it's something that I'd rather troll that time of year just because you cover so much more water and try and contact the fish that's more positive.
that makes a lot of sense to me. It's just a bigger body of water. Listen, I know you guys are all guiding out there, but I also know you're very active with Titletown. I commend you for all the time and effort that you put into that club. I think your club's awesome. I think they do a lot of great things. You've helped that fishery tremendously. Green Bay is such a body. I don't know enough about Green Bay. You're going to teach me this season, though, aren't you? I don't know how much I'm going to fish it. I still have a toughie, and I don't think I'll do well out there with that. But you definitely have to have a bigger boat, no doubt about that.
Well, that's one thing I'll say too. Just if you're thinking of fishing Green Bay, the early season is the best time to target. If fish is smaller in the early season where you can fish these rivers and shallow bays and stuff like that, if you're going to go out in the summer and fish on the bay, watch the weather. Like Joel alluded to it a little bit, but if you see a wind out of the north or the northeast, don't bring out your little boat. Don't try and do it. It's going to be miserable. Like, there's not, I mean, there's some small bays, but it's going to be bad. There's not a place to hide on the bay if it's north or northeast wind, if it's pushing 15 plus. And don't mess around either. Like, if it gets bad, if you think, oh, it's starting to get ugly, it's gonna get worse. And you think, oh, like sometimes you're out there, you think, oh, it'll get better when the sun goes down. It doesn't get better. Those waves keep going. Like, don't mess around out there if you think it's gonna be bad. Even if you get there and you look out and you're like, that looks bad. It's worse than you think it is. Like, there's times when it's really just nasty, and you don't want to go out there in a smaller boat. Like I said, in the spring, it's a lot easier. I fished it in my 16-foot tinner, you know, in the spring, and you know, I fished the river and it was fine. But when you're going out on the bay, there's guys that do it in little boats, but you just got to be smart. You got to watch the weather, and like I said, northeast wind, it's gonna be awful. It's gonna be really bad.
You know what? You know, everybody feels they're invincible fishing in the water, but I'll tell you what. Here's a reality. I had a very close friend of mine, kind of almost like a mentor, and I'm gonna tell you what. He fished out in Green Bay, and it took his life. You know, he was used to fishing it. He's very experienced. He's no longer here. He's gone because of, you know, of the weather. It took his life. You know?
And one big thing with Green Bay too is, I know, I'm sure you guys have seen it. You'll be fishing out there, and all of a sudden that wind will start. You feel that wind kick up, and you're like, oh, I got a half hour, 45 minutes before it starts getting bad. You know, you think in that big body water, it's gonna take a while for it to build up. I've had it where I feel that wind. I tell my clients, we got to go now. By the time we get in, there's 4 or 5 footers crashing in behind us, and that's a short little run, a 6-mile run, and there's 4 footers crashing in. They will build and snap like that. So when you feel that wind kick up, get off the water.
I appreciate you guys coming up here.
Thanks for having me.